War is always evolving. The Revolutionary, especially the Napoleonic Wars, saw the culmination of technology and tactics into a new form of warfare that would reshape war for decades to come. At the forefront of those changes were the French, but to find the origins behind why they came about, you have to go back before the start of the French Revolution. The old army of France under the monarchy resembled most other militaries of Europe during the 1700s. It mainly consisted of rigid infantry formations and used cavalry and artillery to support the infantry. Artillery mostly consisted of heavier pieces used before battle as a way to soften up an opponent before the infantry was committed. What light artillery existed were few in number, and therefore their impact was limited. Cavalry, meanwhile, held the most prestigious place within the army, as it was generally used to guard the infantry's flanks or as a shock force to break enemy infantry formations. Even still, the cavalry was mainly there to support the infantry. France's military as a whole was dominated by officers from the nobility and filled with men from the lower classes, often without much enthusiasm for their service or duty. Battles at this time were costly even for the victors, and so were rarely decisive, contributing to longer conflicts that could see each side suffer many defeats, but be able to recover and fight on. Conditions that would eventually lead to this changing, however, began even before the French Revolution. France was defeated during the 7 Years' War, but came away from the conflict with a determination to enact military reforms. Light infantry saw its role expanded from a few specialized units into a wider role as a standard part of the army, with normal infantry being trained in light infantry tactics that would eventually allow for every battalion to contain a light infantry element. Likewise, major reforms were undertaken in the artillery corps. The old Valerie system was replaced with the new Gribeauval system, which greatly reduced the size of guns deployed in French service. Roughly 4 sizes made up the Gribeauval system: the 12-pounder, 8-pounder, and 4-pounder field guns, along with the 6-inch howitzer. Important to note is that French measurements at this time differed from other measuring systems such as those employed by the English. So a 12-pounder French cannon would actually be able to fire a shot closer to 13 pounds according to the English measuring system. So generally, France had larger cannons than their opponents. Technological advancements meant that these new guns were much lighter and more accurate than before, which would allow them to be employed against enemy infantry to a much greater effect instead of mostly being relegated to counter battery fire. These changes, along with general organizational changes, meant that by the time of the Revolution, France would have one of the finest artillery corps in Europe. Once the Revolution began, the army, like all other parts of France, was radically changed. Many officers fled both the army and country due to their nobility, leaving a lack of experienced leaders. With the Revolution also came opportunities, however, and for the army, a chance to introduce reforms beyond what was possible under the monarchy. Officers rose from the ranks largely based on ability instead of social status, and were encouraged to deviate more from the old handbooks that dictated rigid formations. Horse artillery was introduced, bringing the mobility of artillery to even higher levels. It would be the beginning of the war in 1792, however, that brought the most drastic changes. Before the Revolution, the Royal Army numbered roughly 150,000 strong, but with the introduction of Levée en masse, in late 1793, that number was increased to over 1 million within a year. Increasing the size of the army so rapidly required a massive restructuring as well. Demi-brigades were formed consisting of 1 old battalion and 2 freshly recruited battalions. 2 or more demi-brigades would be grouped together with artillery to form a division, and would then be able to march or fight independently as the situation required, at least in theory. Unlike the Royal Army, who suffered heavily from desertions, the spirit of the Revolution aided in the creation of such a large force, reducing desertion and allowing a marching speed of 120 paces per minute instead of the old 70 paces. Walking at such a speed and in a divisional structure allowed the abandonment of traditional supply lines in favor of living off the land. In an age where every army was forced to travel by foot and rely on lengthy supply lines, the armies of revolutionary France completely upended the pace that war was fought, and were able to beat back the armies of Europe. It was the drastic reforms of the Revolution that set Napoleon in a position where, for nearly the entire duration of both the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the numerous coalitions would be forced to play catch-up with the French. During his early career, Napoleon did not have the authority to enact major reforms on his own. He did benefit greatly, however, from the reforms that took place before and during the Revolution. Upon becoming first consul and then emperor, he did have the power to change the army however he wished. Some reforms were introduced during his reign, such as the introduction of 6-pounder artillery to find a middle ground between the old 4-pounder and 8-pounder system. His most significant contributions were to how the army was organized into corps. Napoleon contributed much more to reforms outside of the army than within it. Where Napoleon did excel, however, was in how he made use of the mobility and speed that reforms allowed to outmaneuver his opponents. Possibly his greatest feat was the defeat of the Austrians at Ulm, where he defeated a force of 70,000 by simply outmaneuvering them. Unfortunately, Napoleon's brilliant use of maneuver would fade somewhat as Napoleonic wars progressed, with the French often able to match their opponents numerically and coalition forces adapting to French tactics. Napoleon simply didn't make as great a use of mobility as he did in his earlier years. It would still appear on occasion, especially when France was severely outnumbered, such as during the coalition's advance on Paris, where Napoleon used his small force's speed and maneuverability to inflict stinging defeats on his opponents. Though Napoleon may have lost in the end, his demonstration of what a quick and mobile army could accomplish left its mark, little of which could have been accomplished without the reforms and revolution which transformed the French army into something entirely new.